Dorothy Freeman is the granddaughter of Dorothy Baker, so it seems very appropriate that she has written a biography on her grandmother. She moved to the United States with her parents when she was quite young, and later took her degree at Goddard College in Vermont. Later, her career was in television. For one time, she worked in television news for 3 stations simultaneously, and she has served on many Baha'i institutions. When I spoke with Dorothy yesterday, she said that one of the greatest experiences in her life has been to go pioneering. She considers it quite a blessing, and says that since at the age of around 21, when she really felt that she really wanted the faith and felt an appreciation for the faith, this has been a very good experience for her. Of course, she was taught by her parents the Baha'i faith. So I'd like everyone to help me in welcoming Dorothy Freeman for her presentation, The Life of Dorothy Baker.
If you'll bear with me, I'll read one more prayer. This is the prayer at the beginning of the tablet, Law-i Dunya, which is addressed to 2 hands of the cause. I think it's appropriate to read it, and later on I'll be referring to a few quotations from it. Light and glory, greeting and praise be upon the hands of his cause, through whom the light of fortitude hath shone forth, and the truth hath been established, that the authority to choose rests with God, the powerful, the mighty, the unconstrained, through whom the ocean of bounty hath surged, and the fragrance of the gracious favors of God, the Lord of mankind, hath been diffused. We beseech him, exalted is he, to shield them through the power of his hosts, to protect them through the potency of his dominion, and to aid them through his indomitable strength, which prevaileth over all created things. Sovereignty is God's, the creator of the heavens and the Lord of the kingdom of names. Dorothy Baker was a unique individual. I'm sure you're all aware of that because she was named a Hand of the Cause. But I think it's important to remember that each of us is, in fact, a struggling child of God, and that none of us are born Hands of the Cause, or LSA members for that matter. We're all born to learn. And I think the overwhelming theme of the book, From Copper to Gold, is that Dorothy Baker spent her life, as we all do, failing sometimes and succeeding other times. As it worked out in her life, the success seems to have outweighed the failure by a good measure. But in both the prayers read this morning and in this one for the Hands of the Cause, it becomes clear that in fact it is God's doing, it's not our own. The qualities that she reflected were not owned by Dorothy Baker. They were the result of an effort to reflect God. And I think we can all do that to whatever extent we wish. It's simply a matter of choice, not really a matter of being appointed, you know. I mean, she was appointed a Hand of the Cause because of the tremendous service that she rendered, because of the sacrifices she chose to make for the cause. I think this is always true of well-known people in whatever field they may function. Eventually people start to know their name and they think, oh, well, they're well known in that area. Of course they're good at it. But the truth is, they began as we all began. Curtis Kelsey said to Abdu'l-Baha, you know, I don't understand. What's the difference between us? He was a very frank person. He wasn't afraid of saying what was on his mind. And Abdu'l-Baha said, the difference is that I always rely and remember Baha'u'llah, and you sometimes forget. I think this is the difference between all of us and Abdu'l-Baha, the main difference. If we could just always remember that he's with us and he's assisting us, and that really the power of good and the power of evil are both not within our grasp unless we're reliant on Him. Yeats wrote a poem. We live in Ireland now. I'm not Irish. My name tag says Ireland, and I think people expect a brogue. But in fact, we've only been there 9 months. When we first went there, we lived in an area called Ross's Point. If you've read Yeats, you remember he writes, "Far off by furthest Rosses, we footed all the night, weaving olden dances, exchanging hands and weaving dances." It's just such a melodious poem that he wrote. But he wrote one that I think is a bit more relevant to our subject today, that I happen to have read as a result of living there. I'd never come across Yeats much before. It's called "Are You Content?" I call on those that call me son, grandson, or great-grandson, on uncles, aunts, great-uncles, or great-aunts, to judge what I have done. Have I that put it into words spoilt what old loins have sent? I, spiritualized by death, can judge. I cannot, but I am not content. His concern, as far as I can understand, was that he wasn't despoiling the memory, as he wrote of the people that he knew, of his ancestors, which he did write of a great deal. They meant a lot to him, and yet he feared that from the next world their eyes, spiritualized by death, saw the immense flaws in what he had done, and perhaps even were offended. This fear hasn't really entered my mind too often because I read some books on biography during the time I was beginning this book, and I think the general image that we hope for in a biography is somewhat like that a portrait painter would hope for. It's not a photograph. It's not an exact reproduction. It can be, but it needn't necessarily be. What it needs to be is to capture something of the essence of that individual. That was my hope in writing this book, and I'll wait until the next world to see if I've succeeded or not, I suppose, when I finally get to know my grandmother. The methods I used are not really common with biography written among the Baha'is. That's partially because I think when we write of very great people, we hesitate to take any liberties. And this is as it should be. Balyuzi, of course, was very exacting in all of his work, and he never would probably have thought of considering what Baha'u'llah or the Bab or Abdu'l-Baha was going through emotionally, during a particular time in their life, because he could not conceive of that. And neither can we. We can never conceive of what one of the central figures of the faith might have been going through. However, in a biography of a mortal man or woman like ourselves, perhaps it's possible to understand something of what they experienced. There's a gentleman who's written quite a few biographies in the States and is well respected. He left his school at Harvard, getting his doctorate, in order to simply pursue writing biographies. And he wrote one on Andrew Jackson, which apparently was well accepted. He said, when I was writing of Andrew Jackson, I smoked a corncob pipe. Coming from someone else, this may sound frivolous or foolish even, but coming from this very renowned authority on biography, I think that we have to consider, why would he do such a thing? Another thing this same gentleman said was that experience is something that is essential to write the life of another human being, and that they never teach this in graduate school. But if you think about it, it's very difficult to write with any understanding of someone's life unless you've experienced something similar to what they might have experienced. I was very lucky in that shortly after I started the book, we went on pilgrimage. I'd only written 3 chapters. It was a school project. My mother was going to write the rest of the book. I was only writing the first 5. But I put the 3 chapters in my suitcase at the last minute. I just threw them on. They were in a little thin blue folder, because I thought maybe on pilgrimage someone would be able to help me, know if I was going in the right direction. I got there and I mentioned to Ethel Crawford that I'd very much like someone to glance over my work so far. And before I knew it, Ethel rang me back and said, well, Marion Hoffman would be happy to meet with you. And I was horrified. I'd never met anyone like Mrs. Hoffman who'd had so much to do with literature and with history and with the writing and producing of books. She was hardly the kind of person I intended. I simply meant someone to tell me if it was blasphemy or not. Because again, I was approaching it in this sort of different way. Well, Marion met me at the hotel, the Knopf Hotel, and we walked down the hill to the better hotel, the Dan Carmel, for breakfast, which she very kindly treated me to. As we walked, she talked about the work in progress for her, which was editing that early book of Mujan Momen that takes all the quotations referring to the Baha'i faith for quite a long period. And she told me, Mujan did all the research himself. He's quite a genius. He did it in 5 languages. The only one he doesn't speak is German. He had to have some help on that. She said, Mujan, when he was working with Mr. Valyuzi, was in medical school full time, and yet he was able to do this tremendous research. As it happened, the package he was carrying was quite large, of course, and it had the same exact blue manila cover that my little tiny package had. Well, I was really feeling like sinking into the cement at that point because I couldn't imagine what she would say of my humble efforts. But as always, she was gracious and said that, in fact, she thought it was going in the right direction and to keep on as I was. And also that she had some material that she would be happy to supply me with about the end of Dorothy Baker's life. Well, this thrilled me, and it gave me the courage to go on with this particular approach I was taking. This approach, if you've read the introduction to the book, is somewhat described. Lewis Mumford said that the biographer must replace the missing nose and plaster of a statue, even if he can't find the original marble. This is something I tried to do, not with facts, but rather with details of setting and of mood, details of words. I think in just about any history or biography, we can't really hope to know exactly what went on. Even Boswell and Johnson, Johnson was a well-known biographer in the 18th century, and Boswell was his biographer. Boswell's method was to follow Johnson everywhere he went and write down everything he said, and even introduce conversations so that he could record Johnson's response. He was a very lucky biographer, needless to say, but his work is somewhat slanted as a result. Even in a case like that, he couldn't have gotten the exact words that Johnson said because it isn't possible, unless you have a tape recorder, which of course they didn't have then. Now, this may not seem like a very convincing point, but I'd like to share with you something that perhaps will help you see what I consider the difference between a chronological biography and a more narrative kind of biography. I won't say fictionalized because that's a horrible word to use in anything that's truthful. But I mean, a docudrama, we see them on television sometimes, they literally have nothing to do with the true thing that happened, on what would have been shown if it were a documentary. So I'm not talking about that approach, I'm simply talking about expanding. What I'd like to share with you is something from Andrew Carnegie. He wrote his autobiography, and he was very open about his early life. He was a Western Union telegraph boy, and he delivered these messages with all the other boys and had a marvelous time doing it. But sometimes they would get into little quarrels because there were these dime messages. These dime messages were sent out beyond a certain circumference of the city, and when you delivered them, you got an extra dime. So the boys were all anxious for those. Now, the only news anyone knows of Andrew Carnegie's early life is in his autobiography, and he writes, "In some cases, it was alleged boys had now and then taken a dime message out of turn. By way of settlement, I proposed that we should pool these messages and divide the cash equally. I was appointed treasurer, and peace and good humor reigned ever afterwards." Well, that's factual enough, isn't it? I mean, it's pretty clear what he said. There was some arguing among the boys. They finally worked it out. Largely, he worked it out, in fact. And it doesn't sound like he's bragging. It sounds like he's, in fact, saying it as it was. Now, here, a biographer of Carnegie chose to use only the facts. He didn't embellish. He didn't narrate beyond the facts that were there, and yet listen to what he came up with. Andy was greedy for these assignments. Well, this is true. Andrew Carnegie wrote that everyone was greedy for the assignments. Bickering and quarrels broke out. Finally, the extra money was pooled. These are facts. But because his leaning was away from truth and toward a biased view of Andrew Carnegie, he was able to abuse his subject matter to such an extent that it really was nowhere near truth. So, in this approach taken in From Copper to Gold, although the exact instances are not recorded as they were, the effort was made to find truth, not to disguise truth or to make Dorothy seem less good or more good than she really was. In history, a lot of people in writing biography have made a point of warping truth, if I may say so. From the earliest days, this was in fact the standard. In Rome, they used to have these funerals. This is sort of the early days of biography, before it was considered an art form or a form of literature or history, which didn't come until about the 18th century. In Rome, the only form of biography they had was when a person died. Is it a pyre that they put the body on? They would carry the body in great procession and place it up on this built-up matter to set fire to it. But before they set fire to it, actors dressed as the ancestors of this person that was dead would file in and sit on ivory carved seats around the pyre. Then, before they set fire to the body, an orator would stand up and give this tremendous eulogy of the person's life, of the person's accomplishments, of the person's family, of the ancestors. These were greatly loved by the Romans, who adored, fame and fortune and pride. Cicero said that by these early biographies, by these laudatory speeches, our history has become quite distorted, for much is set down in them that never occurred. False triumphs, false relationships. This was the standard for many years. It wasn't until really kind of a card named Lytton Strachey wrote a book called The Eminent Victorians, and in it he absolutely made biography the most exciting thing going. He was really a well-known writer in his day. He's been forgotten now, and for good cause, because a lot of what he wrote were lies. But what he said made biography an interesting art form for many people for the first time, because he brought the personality into it. He brought the individual into it. And this was important. Baluzzi wrote, of course, of these figures that were far beyond what we can comprehend. History and biography, to me, are very different. Thomas Carlyle said that biography is really just a string of very impressive, very important lives, and that this is all that has directed the world. That the social trends, the economic trends, religion, none of these had anything to do with it. In fact, the real truth simply centered around these great men who were very powerful and made tremendous decisions, like Frederick the Great, and that they determined all of history. It's interesting that he wrote in the mid-19th century, at the time of the beginning of our faith, because we can really accept that, can't we? Not in the terms he said it, because he was speaking mainly of political figures, of powerful men. But I think when we look at the manifestations of God, we can partially accept what he was saying. Baluzzi said the towering grandeur, the compelling majesty, and the tender beauty of the life of a manifestation of God cannot be comprehended by events usually associated with a saintly life. The manifestation of God is the archetype, and his life is the supreme pattern. His vision, not arrested by time and space, encompasses the future as well as the past. He is the only and necessary link between one cycle of social evolution and another. Without him, history is meaningless and coordination is impossible. So although Baluzzi wrote biography, he was really writing history. We can call it biography, but in fact, he was writing of these figures that tie the whole world together, that make our lives what it is today. We know that all the wonders and the arts come as a result in this age of Baha'u'llah's coming. When I'm sitting at my computer, sometimes I say, I can't believe that Baha'u'llah came, and as a result all these phenomena have appeared in our lives. We can zip over from Ireland to Canada and zip back again the next week. It's a marvelous thing, really. I'm sure you would like to hear something of Dorothy Baker, and I'd like to talk about it. I didn't want to talk about her totally because I felt that many of you may have read the book or at least glanced through it. You know, this La'i Dunya is an interesting tablet which opens addressing two hands of the cause, one appointed by Baha'u'llah and one later appointed by Abdu'l-Baha, because I think it gives a vision, as all of Baha'u'llah's tablets do, of what we should be striving for. Because it opens with this prayer for the hand of the cause, I've taken a few quotations from it in the hope of showing you some aspects of Dorothy Baker's life. Does anybody know who the evil one is? Who's Satan in the Baha'i faith? Self? That's right. Abdu'l-Baha says the insistent self is Satan. And I think we've all experienced that many times. In La'i Dunya, he talks about the evil one. He says, it's exciting really to think about it, because if the evil one is self, that means we do have control with the help of God, of Satan, and we can no longer say, the devil made me do it, like they've been saying for generations in the past. Baha'u'llah says, watch over yourselves, for the evil one is lying in wait, ready to entrap you. Gird yourselves against his wicked devices, and led by the light of the name of the all-seeing God, make your escape from the darkness that surroundeth you. Let your vision be world-embracing, rather than confined to your own self. Arise, O people, and by the power of God's might, resolve to gain the victory over your own selves, that haply the whole earth may be freed and sanctified from its servitude to the gods of its idle fancies. What do we pray about in the long obligatory prayer? That's one thing, isn't it? To have these idle fancies removed from our minds. Dorothy Baker often called them useless thoughts. At one point, when Sue Fouts ran into Dorothy Baker very early on in Mrs. Fouts' Baha'i life, I believe, and rather late in Dorothy Baker's, she said, how do you do it? You know, how do you keep these pure thoughts in mind? How do you achieve this? Actually, what she said was, how do you act as you do? How are you such a spiritual being? And this is what Dorothy Baker said. She said, I try to turn my back on useless thoughts. At all times, I try to remember spiritual qualities. It's amazing, isn't it? At all times. Abdu'l-Baha says our thoughts are our reality. I think Thora Aford was talking about that the other day. These images, just now they're coming upon this in medical science. What we think about is us. If I'm thinking bitter, unfriendly thoughts and smiling, it's really not going to come across as a smile at all, is it? In fact, you'll know, because my reality is bringing to you what's inside me. Now, this thing of the self, you know, Dorothy Baker had some tests with this. One person said, I didn't put this in the book because it didn't seem appropriate, but this one lady said, you know, when we first met Dorothy, my mother and I, they were very active Baha'is, we were quite worried because she seemed to have such a big ego. We thought, how will she ever make it in this faith? But this faith has a way of banging the ego around, doesn't it? Until we finally just say, oh, forget it, you know. I'm tired of holding on to that. It's not doing me any good and it's hurting everybody else. You all know the story, do you, of Greenacre and Louis Gregory's Saving Grace? Dorothy was speaking. She'd spoken at Llewellyn several times, but this was her first chance at Greenacre School, which was renowned. You know, she spoke at Llewellyn the first year that it was open, so it was like any new school. You know, a small number of people attended, and they were kind of folks that you already knew, and she taught the youth out on the grass in the garden. But here she was at Greenacre, and this was very exciting for her. So she carefully prepared her course on the Dawnbreakers, which she loved, and every day, you know, she would give her talk, and people would come up afterwards and say, oh, Dorothy, that was beautiful. How did you ever come up with those apt analogies? Everything was so perfect. And slowly, you know what happened. Finally, the last day, Louis Gregory came up to her. She'd noticed him several times during the week, but he'd always slipped out a side door after she spoke. Louis said, oh, Dorothy, that was a beautiful talk. arranging her papers so as not to seem that she cared too much what he was saying, wondering how she should reply so as not to seem egotistical, but at the same time to find out which bits he liked best. He said, before she could reply, he said, "You thought so too, didn't you?" Well, she didn't miss the intended meaning. She was mortified and had no reply. He said, "You know, Dorothy, the minute you think this is coming from Dorothy Baker instead of from Baha'u'llah, that's the moment that your service to him ends." That's potent, isn't it? Because we're so used to doing things for the adulation of others, aren't we? You know, we're so used to wanting to be seen as someone in the eyes of other people. And in the faith we find that this is not the standard. I loved the analogy yesterday. Was it Don Rogers who spoke of Mozart, the 9,000 instruments, the 10,000 voices raised in the Ode of Joy? You know, this is how I think it's a wonderful analogy of how we can see one another, that we're all in it together, singing this Ode of Joy to God. It's not a question of being distinct, of getting off and singing in a warped voice out louder than everybody else. You know, what good is there in that? You ruin the music, and of course it's a tremendous torment for your own soul to require that kind of attention. The distinction Baha'u'llah wants for us is spiritual distinction. And it's always helped me that Dorothy struggled so much with these other kinds of distinction, wanting them, achieving them, enjoying them, and then giving them up. Baha'u'llah says, "We have, at the bidding of the omnipotent ordainer, breathed a new life into every human frame, and instilled into every word a fresh potency. Wherefore fear ye, O my beloved ones." We don't have to be afraid of anything, because this potency has been instilled into us. You know, when Dorothy died, Florence Mayberry was in Montreal, and she went up to the room of Abdu'l-Baha there in the house of the Maxwells, and she prayed. And as she prayed, she had a tremendous feeling that Dorothy Baker was saying that she would help her. That she was saying that there's a spirit flowing, and the spirit exists, and it's irrelevant. That it wants to flow through all of us if we just open up. And if we open up, it will flow through us and will be used as an instrument. This meant a great deal to Florence, as it meant to me when I read her account of that. Because it takes us away from thinking, oh, well, sure, he can do that, but, you know, he's got his doctorate. Or she can do that because, you know, her grandmother was a hand in the cause. It's not like that at all, is it? It's irrelevant. All those things are meaningless. Absolutely meaningless. The only thing that matters is that we turn to God and say, use me. And as Mildred Mataheta says, and then relax. And he'll do it, huh? Frank Baker was an incredible person. You know, I just read, "Wherefore fear ye, O my beloved ones." I want to tell you a little story about him because it's not in the book. There are quite a few things that couldn't be fit in. Again, it's Louis Gregory. He was such an important influence on his families. I'm sure he was on hundreds of families. Louis Gregory rang Frank, and we say rang in Ireland. We don't say called, so forgive me if you don't understand. He telephoned Frank and said, "I'm coming into Lima. I'd love to see you. Let's have lunch." And Frank said, "Fabulous," because he really liked Louis. Louis was very sharp and interesting and educated and a fine companion for any person. He said, "I'll take you to lunch at the Argonne Hotel." Louis said, "Marvelous. I'll see you at the train station." Then Frank started thinking, oh, gee, you know, the Argonne Hotel is segregated. Lima was a very small, backward, Midwestern town. I can't take him there. That would be inappropriate. It might make him uncomfortable. It would certainly make the hotel people uncomfortable. It might cause a scene. I think I won't. And he said, "No, that's wrong. Louis Gregory is one of the finest men I've ever met. Why should I not take him to the finest place for lunch?" Slowly over the next couple of days until Louis came in, he talked himself into this, and he understood that there was no other option but to do what he had said. He lost his fear. So that when Louis Gregory came into the train station, he was there in his car. He opened the door for Louis. He closed the door after him. He drove him up to the very front door of this nicest hotel in the little town of Lima Hotel, leaped out again before the doorman could get to the door, opened it up, escorted Louis into the restaurant, and the maitre d' was all a-flurry because Frank had called ahead and said, get a table ready for us. I have a very important guest. So they were all, scurrying around, making sure that everyone was comfortable. By the afternoon, the word was all over Lima, Ohio. Have you heard Frank Baker is entertaining a king of Africa? So this was fearlessness, wasn't it? It was rising above the mundane. Also in that tablet, it says, "Do not busy yourselves in your own concerns. Let your thoughts be fixed upon that which will rehabilitate the fortunes of mankind. Valiant acts will ensure the triumph of this cause." What's a valiant act? Lots of them. Lots of big valiant acts we can think of. But the valiant acts I'm thinking of right now aren't so well known to other people. They're smaller. They're more personal. These acts are just as valiant. In some cases, they're much more difficult than the big things. For instance, Frank lost his first wife. Prior to that, at a young age, he'd lost his mother to illness. After marrying Dorothy, he lost his daughter Sally to illness. This is a tremendous tragedy, isn't it? Dorothy was terribly upset by this as well. Here she was trying to care for these children, and in fact one of them died. Through no fault of hers, but still. They could have been very bitter, couldn't they? To me, it's a valiant act that as a result of Sally's death, Frank and Dorothy, for the first time, became really active Baha'is in Buffalo. Now, who cares who's an active Baha'i in Buffalo? You go, we all say, well, so what? Buffalo's a little town, blah, blah, blah. The world would say that, wouldn't it? An active Baha'i in Buffalo. Well, that's nothing to be so proud of, we value other things, don't we? We value fame and fortune and big names in this culture and in all the cultures around the world right now, unfortunately, at least most of the Western ones. But this was a valiant act, choosing not to be bitter over this terrible tragedy that befell them. Other valiant acts, I think, in Dorothy's life, of course, we can name the big ones too, and we can say that we would aspire to do those. But it's that time when we're all alone and we're so tempted to be angry and bitter and resentful. And we all face this, I think, on a regular basis. What about her pilgrimages? She wanted so much to meet the Guardian. The Guardian was the pivot of her life long before she became a hand of the cause. Every word he said, she wrote, she pored over it, and she corresponded with him at great length. Talking about tests and writing the book, one of my tests in writing this book was that I loved her letters to the Guardian. They were so beautiful. And they were all intertwined throughout the book. I just loved being able to read them, and I would turn to them sometimes and read over them again because they were so longing, so filled with love, so anxious for his approval, for his support, to do anything to help him the way we must feel toward the House of Justice. There were some letters buried deep in my mother's files. A lot of this work, all the research my mother did, Louise Matthias, all of it, except for a very small amount. But I didn't bother with her correspondence because she had tremendous numbers of letters. Mother wrote, I don't even know how many hundreds of letters to various people, sometimes writing 5 letters just to pull 1 or 2 lines from them about the time they met Dorothy Baker. So buried in this file, deep back, because they were filed according to date, were some letters that I happened to glance through after the book was already sent off to George Ronald to be typeset. These letters were from the House of Justice. And they said, "We are very happy to enclose these letters from Dorothy Baker to the Guardian and to Abdu'l-Baha, but we request that before you publish them or show them to anyone, you obtain our permission." Well, I really didn't know what to do. Well, I did know what to do. I quickly rang May Valerio, the editor of the book, who lives in Switzerland, and I said, old world speaking here, I said, "May,
what can you do about this? You know, her father's on the House of Justice. I thought maybe. She said, to her credit, I didn't want her to do anything really. I just wanted her to sort of ease me out of it. Because I was mortified. Here I'd almost disobeyed the House of Justice. If the book had come out, if I hadn't happened to look through that file. So she said, I think you should handle it. I said, oh, right. So I sat down and composed my only letter to the House of Justice and said, this is the situation. I Xeroxed all the letters. I said how I led into each of them. And May said, I really think that there won't be any problem because quite a few books have come out that contain letters to the Guardian. And I said, oh, gee, I hope not, because I was feeling awful because not only was I possibly offending the House of Justice, I was also putting George Ronald out because they were already typesetting the book. And it would have been quite expensive for them if they'd gotten as far as one of these letters to have to go back and take it out. Well, the result was that, in fact, they did ask me to remove the letters. But the funny thing was, it was so easy to do. Sometimes, I guess, when you choose to do the right thing, it just is so simple. It was so easy to just kind of scoop them out, like taking a bug off the top of a surface of water. It was just nothing. And my attachment to them went away. Another thing that happened like that was that Dorothy, according to all the records, met Abdu'l-Baha in Montclair, New Jersey in June 1912, according to everything I could find. And there was this marvelous recollection from Howard Colby Ives, I believe, in Promulgation of Universal Peace that dealt with this particular meeting in Montclair, New Jersey. Gave the date. It gave the wonderful, interesting introduction of how the people responded as they entered the room to Abdu'l-Baha, of what he said to the people before he began his talk, of a conversation that was going on just before. So I'd interwoven this into the prologue, and I thought it was lovely. I was very attached to it. As Betty Fisher was talking about how authors get this way. We get very tied into what we've done. Well, I came across late in the writing a bit of paper. In the olden days, quote, apparently Baha'is had to write down what they'd done, where they'd taught, where they'd gone to feast, where they'd met Baha'is, every single thing they'd done in their Baha'i life. And then it said, so sweet, at the bottom of the form, meetings with Abdu'l-Baha, : and you were supposed to fill in your meetings with Abdu'l-Baha. So Dorothy Baker had filled in her meeting with Abdu'l-Baha. She'd put New York, autumn, 1912. I said, nah. I said, she was getting older. She probably filled this form out really fast. I said, I think I'll just skip this. But maybe I'll check with a couple of people and see if they think it's a big deal. So I said, do you think this is a big deal? You don't, do you? And they go, no, I don't think it's a big deal. So I said, me either. Worked so well the other way. And they said, yeah. Well, closer to the time of publication, to the time of my sending the manuscript in, I came upon another of these notorious bits of paper in her own handwriting that claimed that she'd met Abdu'l-Baha in New York in the autumn of 1912. Again, I was just mortified, but this time I said, okay, am I going to tell the truth or what? This is a kind of switching around of facts that I just did not feel comfortable with. And the funny thing was, it happened just like with the letters from the House of Justice, the letters to Shoghi Effendi that the House of Justice asked not be printed. It just was so easy. In spite of all the little tendrils of information that were connecting into each other in that prologue, in spite of how I felt I'd so beautifully sort of knotted the whole thing in with the quotations from Promulgation of Universal Peace, it just lifted out like it didn't even belong there. It was a wonderful feeling, really. It's a funny thing how when you try to hold as close as you can to what you perceive as truth, it really isn't so hard. Yeah. I should say that this decision on the part of the House of Justice was, of course, very timely. And thinking back on it, I can really understand. I mean, what if you wrote letters to the House of Justice pouring out your heart, or even to Shoghi Effendi? Would you really want generations of the future to read them? They're really very private, and I feel much better that they aren't in now looking back at the book. Because you don't want to... There's a point beyond which there shouldn't be any passing, and perhaps that is the point. Well, I could go on, but I think it's best to stop. Is our time about over?
I think maybe we could take a few more minutes.
Okay. Shall we have questions, perhaps? Or
That sounds good.
okay. Thank you. Thank you. I think that, for each work deserves credit. I find research tedious, very tedious. I don't like to write 5 letters to one person trying to get their 3-line memory of whomever it was. I don't enjoy that. And I do enjoy, sifting through the material and trying to find how it relates. So I think they're 2 different things. And I think that they're both worthwhile. Yeah. Gail, right. The first question had to do with where should the credit really lie? Should it lie with the researcher or with the author? And the second question deals with, can I speak of the magnetism of Dorothy Baker? Well, not having ever heard her, except as a 2.5-year-old, it's a bit difficult for me to really talk about her magnetism on a personal level, but I can only say what the writings say, and that is that these things are not of the person. I think her ability wasn't having a fabulous personality or being utterly charming or having gone to the right schools and so knowing how to make chit-chat with people. I mean, I don't think it was Dorothy Baker, frankly. I think it was purging her heart to the extent that she became, a wonderful channel. Is that sufficient? There's the North. And 2 men were there who live in the North, Persian Baha'is, Rustam and Behman Khosravi, and they were both in Karachi that day that she left Karachi and her plane crashed. And they remembered her saying to the friends gathered there who had arisen to pioneer, they remember her saying to them, "Oh, I wish I had some gift to give you, but I can only give you my life." And then, of course, she flew away. When she did fly, though, a lot of people had dreams, and dreams are very nice. We don't have to put a lot of stock in all kinds of visions and dreams. I mean, this is not the way that God trains us in this day. He trains us through the words of Baha'u'llah and the Bab. But sometimes they are very revealing. A lot of people dreamt of Dorothy Baker after her plane went down, and one of them said something that I think was very beautiful. They said that she appeared to them in their dream and said, "I never went down. I went straight into the arms of my Lord."